They celebrated my sister for getting a B+. But when I brought home perfect grades, my parents barely looked up. That was the moment I realized something was very wrong in my family. Every child remembers the first time they feel invisible. For me, it happened at the kitchen table. I walked in holding my report card with shaking hands, proud because every single grade was perfect. I thought maybe this time my parents would smile, hug me, or at least tell me they were proud. Instead, my mother glanced at the paper while folding laundry and casually said, "Good job, we knew you could do it." Then she went right back to what she was doing. No celebration, no excitement, nothing. A week later, my younger sister came home with a single good grade in math, and suddenly the entire house transformed into a celebration. My parents took her out to dinner, praised her effort all night, and acted like she had achieved something extraordinary. I sat quietly at the table, pushing food around my plate, wondering why being dependable made me disappear, while struggling made her special. As the years passed, the pattern only became more painful. My sister got tutors whenever school became difficult. I stayed up alone teaching myself because everyone assumed I would figure it out. She received comfort, encouragement, and expensive support whenever she needed help. I received responsibility. When my sister wanted guidance applying for schools, my parents hired professionals to help her prepare. I spent hours in the public library researching scholarships by myself because nobody offered to help me. Even birthdays felt different. I was lectured about saving money and becoming independent. While my sister received gifts, praise, and I convinced myself that maybe being strong meant accepting less love. But deep inside, every ignored achievement felt like another crack forming in my heart. The worst part was hearing the same sentence over and over again. Whenever I questioned the unfairness, "You're mature. You understand." And eventually I did understand. I understood that in my family, needing help earned attention, while surviving quietly earned abandonment. My Aunt Helen was the only person who noticed the truth. One Thanksgiving, she looked directly at my father and warned him that he was taking advantage of me because I never complained. But he only shrugged and said, "Cora is fine. She always is." Those words stayed with me for years because they explained everything. I wasn't loved less because I failed. I was loved less because I learned how to survive alone. I didn't know it yet, but that loneliness was about to cost me far more than attention. It would eventually change the entire course of my life forever. And what happened next, at the moment I discovered where my college money really went, completely destroyed my trust in my family. If this story touched you even a little, subscribe and stay with me for the next part, because the truth hiding behind my parents' favoritism becomes even more shocking than you can imagine. I thought my college fund was waiting for me, until my parents sat me down and admitted they had given everything to my younger sister. I can still remember the exact feeling in my chest that evening. I walked into the kitchen holding my university acceptance letters so tightly the paper was wrinkled at the corners. After years of studying alone, applying for scholarships without help, and working harder than anyone realized, I had finally done it. I had been accepted into the state university with partial financial aid. For the first time in years, I actually felt hopeful. I knew there was still the issue of housing, books, and living expenses, but I wasn't worried because my grandparents had prepared a college fund for both me and my sister years earlier. My parents had talked about it my entire childhood. They always said my grandfather wanted both granddaughters to have equal opportunities. So that night, I sat down at the kitchen table, expecting a normal conversation about tuition and paperwork. Instead, my parents exchanged a strange look that immediately made my stomach tighten. My mother took a deep breath and quietly said, "We need to talk about the fund." Something in her voice felt cold. I asked what was wrong, and then my father finally said the sentence that changed my life forever. "Madison is going to need more support than you." At first, I honestly didn't understand what he meant. I thought maybe they planned to split the money differently for a short time, or help her temporarily. But then he explained that they had decided to give the entire college fund to my sister, because her grades were weaker, and she needed the opportunity more. I stared at them in complete shock. I remember asking, almost whispering, "But Grandpa made that money for both of us." "Right." My mother's expression hardened immediately. She told me it was family money and that they were making the best decision for the family as a whole. Then my father said something that still echoes in my mind every time I think about that night. "You'll figure it out. You always do. That was it. No apology. No guilt. No hesitation. Just a calm expectation that I would sacrifice my future quietly, because I had always survived without help before. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. My family didn't see me as a daughter who deserved support. They saw me as the reliable one who could endure disappointment without complaining. I went to my room and locked the door, but I didn't cry right away. I just sat there staring at the acceptance letter on my desk while everything inside me slowly collapsed. My dream university suddenly felt impossibly far away. Meanwhile, downstairs, my parents were already discussing dorm decorations and future plans for Madison like nothing had happened. That night, while my sister posted excited messages online about her future private university life, I opened my laptop and searched one thing: military education benefits. Looking back now, I realize that was the exact moment my trust in my family died. Not because they chose my sister over me, but because they expected me to accept it silently. And what happened after I joined the military only proved how little they truly cared about what they had taken from me. If you want to know how this betrayal pushed me into 6 years of sacrifice, while my sister lived the dream that should have been partly mine, subscribe and stay with me for the next chapter, because the truth behind the stolen money becomes even darker from here. The night my sister was shopping for her dream college life, I was secretly signing military papers because my own parents had decided I was the child who could survive without love. I never told anyone where I went that morning. My parents thought I was still upset in my room after they gave my entire college fund to Madison. But instead of crying at home, I was sitting inside a military recruitment office, staring at enlistment papers while trying not to completely fall apart. The room smelled like old coffee and printer ink. A television on the wall played dramatic military commercials, showing soldiers smiling proudly beneath waving flags. But I wasn't there because I dreamed about serving. I was there because my family had quietly destroyed every other option I had. Only a few days earlier, I thought I would be preparing for university orientation like everyone else from school. I imagined decorating a dorm room, meeting new friends, and finally starting a future that belonged to me. Instead, I sat across from a recruiter, listening to explanations about combat training and education benefits, because my parents had handed my future to my younger sister without guilt or hesitation. The recruiter asked if I felt nervous. I almost laughed because nervous was too small a word for what I felt. My chest felt empty. I wasn't choosing a dream. I was choosing survival. I signed every paper slowly, hoping deep inside that maybe my parents would suddenly realize what they had done and stop me before it became real. But they never did. My mother never knocked on my door to ask if I was okay. My father never apologized. Downstairs, they were busy talking excitedly about Madison's university plans, while I quietly prepared to disappear from the life I thought I would have. Later that night, I overheard my mother speaking proudly to one of her friends on the phone. She talked about Madison's future private university, the dorm decorations, and how excited the family was for her next chapter. Then she laughed softly and said Cora decided the military is probably better for her anyway. She's always been independent. That sentence hurt more than everything else combined. They made it sound like joining the military had been my personal dream, instead of a desperate decision caused by betrayal. They rewrote the story so they wouldn't have to feel guilty for sacrificing me. And in that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. My parents loved the version of me that never needed anything. A few weeks later, I arrived at military training carrying one duffel bag and years of buried pain. Everything felt overwhelming. The screaming instructors, the exhaustion, the pressure to become stronger every single day. Every morning started before sunrise, and every night ended with me collapsing into bed, wondering if I had ruined my own life forever. But strangely, military life also gave me something my family never had: recognition. Nobody compared me to Madison there. Nobody ignored my effort because they expected me to survive alone. In training, hard work mattered, discipline mattered, endurance mattered. For the first time, people noticed when I pushed myself beyond my limits. Meanwhile, every time I checked social media during rare breaks, I saw my sister living the exact life that should have partly belonged to me. Football games, parties, sorority events, expensive dinners, smiling family photos celebrating her success. My parents posted constantly about how proud they were of Madison. but they never once posted about me surviving military training. It was like I had completely vanished from the family the second I stopped fitting the image they wanted. And the worst part wasn't the silence. It was realizing how easy it was for them to forget me. If this story touched you, subscribe and stay for the next part, because what I discovered years later about the stolen money and my family's lies destroyed everything I thought I knew about them. While I was learning how to survive military life, my family was acting like my sister was their only child. The hardest part about military life wasn't the exhaustion or the endless pressure. It was realizing how easy it had become for my family to live without me. Every morning began before sunrise. We ran until our lungs burned trained, until our muscles shook, and followed orders until it felt like our minds never truly rested. Some nights, I fell asleep, still wearing parts of my uniform because I was too exhausted to even move. But no matter how difficult the training became, there was always something that hurt worse than the physical pain. During the rare moments when we were allowed to use our phones, I would open social media and see my family celebrating Madison's life, as if I had completely disappeared. My mother posted photos from football games with captions about how proud she was of Madison's university experience. My father shared pictures of expensive restaurants, family trips, and sorority events. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone seemed to revolve around her. Meanwhile, I was surviving military drills in freezing rain and sleeping in crowded barracks, wondering if anyone at home even missed me anymore. At first, I kept trying. I sent messages updating them about training. I told them when I passed difficult evaluations. I even mailed photos of myself in uniform, secretly hoping my parents would finally look at me with pride. Most of the time, the responses were painfully short. "Good job. Stay safe." Sometimes they replied, days later. Sometimes they didn't reply at all. Once, after completing one of the hardest weeks of training, I called home, feeling more emotionally exhausted than ever before. My mother answered, but before I could even explain what I had accomplished, she interrupted me to talk about Madison's latest sorority event. I sat there silently, listening to her excitement, while realizing she had not asked me a single question about my own life. That was the moment I stopped expecting emotional support from them completely. Meanwhile, Madison's world kept getting bigger and brighter. Her social media was filled with parties, smiling friends, vacations, and stories about exciting opportunities at university. My parents proudly commented beneath every post, like they were watching their dream come true. And maybe they were. I started to understand something painful during those years. My family didn't just favor Madison. They had emotionally built their entire future around her success, while treating my sacrifices like background noise. The loneliness inside military life became overwhelming sometimes. There were nights when other soldiers received care packages from their families, while my mailbox stayed empty week after week. One soldier joked that maybe my family forgot my address. I laughed with everyone else, but later that night I cried quietly in the dark, because part of me feared it might actually be true. The only person who consistently reached out was my Aunt Helen. She sent messages asking real questions. She wanted to know how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough, and if I was handling the stress okay. Once she texted me something I never forgot. "Strong people still deserve support." I stared at that message for a very long time, because nobody in my family had ever made me feel like my pain mattered before. As the years passed, military life slowly transformed me. I became more disciplined, more independent, and emotionally tougher than I had ever been. But underneath all of that strength was still the same daughter who wondered why love inside her family always felt conditional. By the time my service was ending, I had learned how to survive almost anything. What I still hadn't learned was how to stop hoping my parents might finally see me someday. And when I eventually returned home after years away, what I discovered about my family hurt even more than being forgotten. If this story resonates with you, subscribe and stay for the next chapter. Because coming home was the beginning of an even deeper betrayal I never saw coming. My grandmother kept warning me that something about my family didn't feel right, but I never imagined her secret would destroy everything I believed. During my years in the military, there was only one person in my family who consistently reached out to me, like I still mattered: my grandmother Eleanor. Unlike everyone else, she never treated my service like a temporary phase or an inconvenience. She actually asked questions. Real questions. She wanted to know whether I was eating properly, whether I was sleeping enough, and if I felt lonely being so far away from home. Sometimes her calls were short, but there was always something strange hidden beneath her words, like she knew a truth she wasn't ready to tell me yet. One night, after an especially brutal training exercise, I finally had a few minutes alone and decided to call her. I remember sitting outside the barracks under freezing air, staring into the darkness, while my hands still shook from exhaustion. The moment she answered, her voice softened immediately. "Cora, sweetheart, are you really okay?" The question caught me off guard, because nobody else in my family ever asked it like they genuinely wanted the truth. I told her I was managing, even though emotionally I felt completely drained. There was a long silence before she finally said something that stayed in my mind for years. "Your grandfather would be proud of your strength, but strength should never mean suffering alone." I frowned because the sentence sounded strangely personal, almost guilty. Before I could ask what she meant, she continued quietly. "Some things in this family are not what they seem." At the time, I thought she was talking about favoritism or emotional distance. I had no idea she meant something far bigger. After that call, I started noticing small details I had ignored before. Every time I spoke to my parents, they sounded strangely uncomfortable whenever money or college came up. If I mentioned student loans or military benefits, the conversation would quickly shift back to Madison's achievements. My father especially seemed eager to avoid discussing the college fund at all. Meanwhile, my grandmother became increasingly protective toward me in subtle ways. She mailed handwritten letters reminding me to keep copies of financial documents. She told me never to let anyone make me feel guilty for asking questions. Once she even said, "People who insist you stay silent usually benefit from your silence." That sentence hit me harder than she probably realized. Years passed, but her strange warnings never fully left my mind. Then one afternoon, while scrolling through social media during a break, I saw another massive celebration post from my parents about Madison's future MBA plans. They talked openly about paying for her graduate program like money had never been a problem for them. Something about that finally broke through the wall inside my head. I remember staring at my phone thinking the same question over and over again. If they could afford all of this for Madison, why did they tell me there was nothing left for me? That question haunted me for days. I couldn't sleep properly anymore because suddenly every painful memory started connecting together in ways I had avoided before. The favoritism, the missing money, my grandmother's warnings, my parents' discomfort whenever the topic came up. It all felt wrong, deeply wrong. For the first time in my life, I stopped blaming myself and started questioning them instead. Finally, after years of silence, I called my Aunt Helen and asked for the truth. There was a long pause on the phone before she quietly said, "Cora, it's time you knew everything." At that moment, my entire body went cold because deep inside, I already knew whatever came next was going to change my family forever. And I was right. If you think family secrets can destroy lives, comment number 1 below. Because what I discovered after that phone call was far worse than simple favoritism. It was betrayal on a level I never thought possible. After years away in the military, I finally came home. But the moment I walked through the front door, I realized my family had already learned how to live without me. I used to imagine my return differently during lonely nights in the barracks. I thought maybe my parents would hug me tightly at the airport. Maybe my mother would cry a little after not seeing me for so long. Maybe my father would finally look proud when he saw me standing there in uniform after everything I had survived. But reality felt cold from the very beginning. When I arrived home, there was no emotional reunion waiting for me. No excitement. No feeling that I had truly been missed. My mother greeted me with a quick smile before immediately talking about dinner reservations. My father shook my hand awkwardly, like I was a distant relative instead of his daughter. Madison barely looked up from her phone before making a joke about how serious military life had made me look. I laughed politely because I didn't know what else to do, but deep inside, something already felt wrong. During dinner, I sat quietly listening while the conversation revolved entirely around Madison's future MBA applications, networking opportunities, and career plans. My parents spoke about her future like it was the center of the universe. They discussed tuition costs, possible apartments, and which city would be best for her career growth. Nobody asked how military life had affected me emotionally. Nobody asked whether I struggled during deployment. Nobody even asked if I was happy to finally be home. It felt like my entire existence had become background noise inside my own family. At one point, I tried mentioning that I was searching for project management jobs, using the leadership experience I gained in the military. My father nodded distractedly and immediately redirected the conversation back to Madison's graduate school interviews. I remember sitting there staring at the table while a painful realization slowly settled into my chest. They weren't intentionally trying to hurt me anymore. To them, overlooking me had simply become normal. Later that night, I walked through the house, noticing all the things that had changed while I was gone. Expensive new furniture filled the living room. The kitchen had been remodeled. Madison had a brand new car parked outside that my parents proudly called her graduation gift. Everywhere I looked, I saw proof that money had never truly been the issue they claimed it was. They had enough resources to renovate the house, pay for luxury experiences, and continue investing in Madison's future. Just apparently not enough for me. I went upstairs to my old bedroom and sat alone on the edge of the bed for a long time. The room looked smaller somehow, almost unfamiliar. That was when the loneliness hit me harder than it ever had during military service. In the military, at least, I understood why things were difficult. But here at home, surrounded by family, I somehow felt even more invisible. The next morning only made things worse. My mother casually asked if I planned to settle down now since military life was finally over, as if those years had been some temporary phase instead of the sacrifice that shaped my entire adulthood. Then Madison started talking excitedly about her MBA plans again, while my parents listened with complete admiration. I sat there drinking coffee quietly, realizing nobody in that room truly understood what I had lost because of their choices. But something inside me had started changing too. Military life had taught me discipline, patience, and observation. And the more I watched my family interact, the more certain I became that there were truths hidden beneath their perfect image. Little details no longer made sense. The tension whenever finances were mentioned. My grandmother's warnings. The way my father avoided eye contact whenever college expenses came up. Deep down, I could feel it. There was something they didn't want me to discover. And very soon, I was finally going to uncover the secret that would destroy everything my family had spent years trying to hide. If you believe coming home can sometimes hurt more than leave, comment number 3 below. Because what I discovered after returning home changed my life forever. The first person who ever made me feel seen after the military was a stranger. And one simple question from him changed everything. I believed about my family. A few weeks after returning home, I realized something terrifying. I had survived years of military service, brutal training, loneliness, and emotional abandonment. Yet being back with my family somehow felt even more isolating. Every conversation inside that house reminded me that I no longer belonged there. My parents only seemed alive when talking about Madison's future. Meanwhile, I moved through the house like a guest nobody expected to stay for long. That was when I found the Veterans Support Group. Honestly, I didn't go there looking for friendship. I went because I was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending I was okay all the time. The meetings were held inside a small community center, with cheap coffee folding chairs, and people carrying invisible pain behind tired smiles. Everyone there understood things that civilians never seemed to notice. The silence after service, the strange emptiness of returning home, the feeling that life moved on without you while you were gone. During my first meeting, I sat near the back, hoping nobody would talk to me. But then someone sat beside me and quietly asked. First time here, I looked over and saw a man with calm eyes and the same exhausted expression I saw in the mirror every morning. His name was Jake Morrison. He had also served in the military, and somehow spoke with the kind of patience that immediately made people feel safe around him. I nodded awkwardly, and he smiled slightly, before saying, "You're sitting near the exit like you might run away any second." I did the exact same thing my first meeting. That small joke broke through my nervousness enough for me to laugh for the first time in weeks. After the meeting ended, we stayed talking outside longer than I expected. For some reason, conversations with Jake felt easy in a way nothing else did anymore. I didn't have to explain why loud noises still made me tense sometimes or why coming home felt emotionally confusing. He already understood. Over the next few weeks, we started meeting regularly after support group sessions. Coffee turned into long conversations. Long conversations turned into trust. And eventually, without even planning to, I told him the truth about my family. I told him about the favoritism, the stolen college fund, Madison's perfect life, the years I spent convincing myself that I simply needed to be stronger. Jake listened quietly, without interrupting once. Then, after a long silence, he asked me a question nobody had ever asked before. Did your grandmother actually agree to give all the money to your sister? The question stunned me completely. I stared at him because the thought had honestly never crossed my mind. I had spent years assuming my parents were unfair, but never criminal. My parents said it was a family decision, I answered weakly. Jake nodded slowly, then said something that hit me harder than any military training ever had. People who constantly call you strong are sometimes just looking for excuses not to support you. I felt my throat tighten instantly, because deep down I knew he was right. My family praised my independence every single time they wanted to justify abandoning me emotionally. That night, after leaving the cafe, I sat in my car for almost an hour, replaying his question again and again. Did my grandmother really agree to all of it? Why had she sounded so strange during those phone calls? Why did my father avoid talking about money so aggressively? Suddenly, every memory felt different, and for the first time in years, I stopped seeing myself as the problem. Maybe I had never been difficult to love. Maybe my family had simply chosen convenience over fairness. That realization changed something inside me, permanently. Because once you start questioning a lie, you begin noticing every crack holding it together. And very soon I was about to uncover the truth that would completely destroy my parents' carefully constructed image forever. If this story is pulling you in emotionally, subscribe and stay with me for the next chapter. Because the moment I finally confronted the truth about the money became the beginning of the biggest family scandal imaginable. The moment my parents announced they were paying for my sister's MBA, something inside me finally broke. I remember staring at the family group chat on my phone while sitting alone in my apartment after work. Madison had just sent an excited message announcing that she had officially been accepted into one of the top MBA programs in the country. Almost immediately, my mother responded with celebration emojis and emotional messages about how proud she was. My father followed with a long paragraph about how this opportunity would completely transform Madison's future and open doors for the rest of her life. Reading their reactions felt strangely familiar, like watching the same painful movie I had already lived through years earlier. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling growing in my chest. I even typed a polite congratulations message because despite everything, I genuinely knew Madison had worked hard for the acceptance. But then the conversation shifted toward finances and suddenly everything changed. My mother casually mentioned how expensive the program would be, and my father immediately replied that education was an investment worth making. Then came the sentence that completely shattered the last bit of trust I still had left in them. We'll figure out the tuition somehow. Madison deserves this opportunity. I stared at the screen for a long time after reading those words. My hands actually started shaking, because suddenly every excuse they had given me years earlier sounded like a lie all over again. They claimed there wasn't enough money for my future. They told me sacrifices had to be made. They said Madison needed more help than I did. Yet here they were once again finding money, support, encouragement, and emotional energy for her without hesitation. Meanwhile, I had spent years surviving military life, taking out student loans, and rebuilding my future alone. Before I could stop myself, I typed the question that had been haunting me for years. Where exactly is all this money coming from? The chat went silent immediately. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear several times before my father finally answered. Your military benefits covered your education. Madison's situation is different. Different. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. My education had not been covered. I had sacrificed years of my life to survive financially because my parents chose to fund my sister instead of me. I replied carefully, trying to stay calm, even though anger was building inside me faster than I could control. My military benefits covered survival. Madison received private university support, and now an MBA too. Both funded by the same parents who told me there was nothing left for me. My mother immediately accused me of being bitter. Madison complained that I was ruining an important moment for the family. And then my sister said something that completely changed the way I saw her forever. This is why mom and dad focus on me. I don't turn everything into drama. I read that sentence over and over in disbelief. After everything I had sacrificed after every year, I spent convincing myself to stay quiet and mature. I was still somehow the problem in their eyes. That was the moment something inside me finally stopped trying to protect them, emotionally. For years, I had kept making excuses for my parents, because admitting the truth felt too painful. But now the truth was impossible to ignore anymore. This wasn't accidental favoritism. This was a pattern. A deliberate decision repeated again and again, while they expected me to quietly accept less. I closed the group chat without replying further. Then I scrolled through my contacts until I found Aunt Helen's number. My fingers hovered above the call button for several seconds, because deep down I already knew this conversation would change everything. When she answered, I didn't waste time pretending anymore. "I need the truth about the college fund," I said quietly. There was a long silence on the other end, before she finally replied, "Cora, it's about time." And at that moment, I realized my family's biggest secret was finally about to come into the light. When my aunt finally told me the truth about the college fund, I realized my family hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, they had stolen from me. I still remember the sound of Aunt Helen's voice that night, quiet, careful, almost like she was afraid that saying the truth out loud would permanently destroy whatever remained of our family. After our tense conversation in the group chat, I sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone for nearly an hour before finally calling her. Deep down, I already knew something terrible was coming. Nobody avoids simple questions for years unless they're hiding something dangerous. The moment Aunt Helen answered, I skipped every polite introduction. "I need to know what really happened to Grandpa's college fund," I said immediately. There was silence on the line so long that I thought the call had disconnected. Then she sighed heavily and whispered, "Your grandmother begged your parents not to tell you this way." My chest tightened instantly. "Tell me what I asked." Another long pause. Then the truth finally arrived. The money was never supposed to belong only to Madison. I felt my entire body go cold. Aunt Helen explained that my grandfather had created equal trust funds for both granddaughters years before he died. The money had been carefully protected legally, and both girls were supposed to receive the same educational opportunities. But after my grandfather passed away, things inside the family slowly changed. According to Aunt Helen, my parents became increasingly focused on Madison because they believed she needed more support to succeed academically and socially. Meanwhile, they convinced themselves that I was strong enough to survive without help. At first, they only borrowed small amounts from my trust fund to cover Madison's tutoring, private school programs, and extracurricular expenses. But eventually, borrowing turned into taking, and taking became something much worse. "Your father kept saying he would replace the money later," Aunt Helen admitted quietly. "But he never did." I couldn't even speak for several seconds. My mind replayed every painful moment from the past few years differently now. Every time they told me there wasn't enough money, every lecture about sacrifice, every conversation where they praised my independence while funding Madison's future behind my back, it had all been built on a lie. "Did Grandma know?" I finally whispered. Aunt Helen sighed again. "Not at first. Your father hid the transfers carefully, but eventually she discovered discrepancies in the trust paperwork." My stomach twisted violently. "Then why didn't she stop them?" Aunt Helen's voice broke slightly when she answered. "Because by the time she understood how bad it had become, most of the money was already gone, and your parents kept promising they would fix everything before you ever found out." I stood up and started pacing around the apartment because suddenly I couldn't breathe sitting still anymore. Years of military service, years of emotional abandonment, years spent believing my future disappeared because of unfortunate circumstances. None of it had been unavoidable. My family had actively chosen this outcome for me. Worse than the missing money was the realization that they watched me suffer without ever telling the truth. They watched me join the military believing I had no options. They watched me struggle financially while continuing to invest in Madison's dream life. And through all of it, they still expected me to remain grateful, quiet, and understanding. "There's something else," Aunt Helen finally added carefully. I stopped pacing immediately. What her next sentence changed everything. Forever. Your grandmother recently hired a lawyer because she believes your father may have illegally moved more money than anyone realized. I felt like the floor disappeared beneath me. This was no longer just favoritism or betrayal. This was potentially fraud. Family fraud. Suddenly, every warning from my grandmother made terrifying sense. She hadn't been protecting family peace all these years. She had been trying to protect me from discovering how deep the betrayal truly went. And in that moment, I realized there was no going back anymore. The truth had finally surfaced, and my family was about to face consequences they never imagined possible. The day the lawyer showed me the financial records, I finally understood why my father couldn't look me in the eyes anymore. A few days after my conversation with Aunt Helen, I met my grandmother and her lawyer in a quiet office downtown. The entire drive there felt unreal, like my mind still refused to accept that my own family could be hiding something this serious from me for so many years. When I walked into the office, my grandmother immediately stood up and hugged me tightly. She looked older than I remembered, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with age. I could tell she had been carrying this secret alone for a very long time. The lawyer introduced himself as David Brennan and calmly explained that my grandmother recently ordered a full review of the trust funds created by my grandfather. At first, the investigation started because small accounting inconsistencies appeared in the paperwork. But once they looked deeper, the situation became far worse than anyone expected. David placed several folders on the table before carefully sliding copies of financial statements toward me. My hands shook while reading the numbers. Transfer after transfer had been made from my trust fund over many years. Tuition payments, housing expenses, private school fees, luxury purchases connected directly to Madison's lifestyle. The money had quietly disappeared piece by piece while I struggled believing there was nothing left for me. Then David showed me something even worse. Several documents contained signatures authorizing the transfers under my grandmother's name, except she never signed them. "We believe your father forged portions of the paperwork," David said, carefully. The room immediately started spinning around me. I looked at my grandmother, in complete disbelief, hoping somehow this was all a misunderstanding. But tears were already forming in her eyes before she even spoke. "I trusted him," she whispered painfully. "He kept promising he would replace the money before you ever knew." Hearing that hurt almost as much as discovering the theft itself. My father hadn't only stolen from me financially, he had manipulated the people who loved him and expected loyalty in return. Suddenly, every strange moment over the years made horrifying sense. The nervousness whenever finances were discussed, my parents constantly encouraging me to move on, the emotional pressure to stay quiet and grateful. They weren't protecting family peace, they were protecting themselves from consequences. David continued explaining the situation calmly, while I struggled to process everything emotionally. According to preliminary estimates, the missing amount was now significantly larger than the original education fund, because investment growth had also been lost over time. In simple terms, my future had not only been taken from me, it had been stolen and erased piece by piece while my parents watched me sacrifice years of my life believing I had no other options. At one point during the meeting, I finally asked the question nobody wanted to answer. "Does Madison know?" The room fell silent instantly. My grandmother slowly looked down, while David exchanged a careful glance with her before speaking. "We honestly don't know how much she understands." Somehow that answer hurt more than if they had simply said yes, because deep down I realized my sister may have spent years benefiting from stolen money while choosing not to ask where any of it came from. By the time I left the office, I no longer felt confused. I felt angry, truly angry for the first time in my life, not only because of the money, but because my entire family had allowed me to carry the emotional weight of their betrayal alone for years. And at that moment, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I was finally done protecting them. The first time I confronted my parents about the stolen money, my father couldn't even deny it without looking terrified. After meeting with my grandmother and the lawyer, I barely slept for 2 nights. Every memory from my childhood kept replaying in my head differently now. All those moments when my parents told me to be understanding. All the times they praised my independence while quietly taking away opportunities that belonged to me. I realized something painful. They had spent years teaching me to accept less, so they would never have to feel guilty for giving more to Madison. By the third night, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I drove to my parents' house, carrying copies of the financial records in a folder beside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers hurt the entire drive there. Part of me still hoped there was some explanation that would make everything less horrifying, but deep down, I already knew the truth. When I walked inside the house, my mother smiled nervously and asked why I hadn't called first. My father looked up from the living room chair and instantly froze the moment he saw the folder in my hands. That reaction alone told me more than words ever could. Madison was upstairs at the time, so it was just the three of us standing in the living room surrounded by expensive furniture, partially paid for with money stolen from my future. I placed the folder slowly on the table and opened it without saying anything at first. The silence in the room became unbearable. Finally, I looked directly at my father and asked the question I had waited years to say out loud. How much money did you really take from me? My mother immediately started crying before he even answered. That almost made me angry enough to laugh because suddenly they wanted emotions now that the truth had finally caught up to them. My father rubbed his face nervously and muttered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I stared at him in disbelief. Not supposed to happen like this. As if the real tragedy here was simply getting caught. "You forged Grandma's signature," I said quietly. "You stole from your own daughter." He instantly tried defending himself. He claimed he only borrowed the money temporarily and always intended to replace it later. He said Madison needed more support socially and academically. He insisted the family was under pressure financially at the time, but every excuse sounded emptier than the one before it. Because none of those explanations answered the real question haunting me. Why was I always the one expected to suffer? The room went silent again. My father looked down. My mother kept crying softly into her hands. And then something inside me finally broke completely. "Do you understand what you did to me?" I asked, my voice shaking for the first time. "I joined the military because you convinced me there was nothing left for my future. I spent years believing I wasn't worth the same support as Madison." My mother whispered through tears, "That's not true. We love you both." I shook my head immediately. "No, you loved her openly. You loved me conditionally." That sentence hit the room like shattered glass. Nobody denied it because deep down all of us knew it was true. Then my father said the one thing that destroyed whatever emotional connection I still had left with him. "You were always stronger." I laughed bitterly because I finally understood everything. To my parents, my strength had never been something beautiful. It had simply been convenient. Convenient enough for them to sacrifice me emotionally while convincing themselves I would survive it. And the worst part was that they had been right. I did survive, but not without scars that would stay forever. Before leaving, I looked at both of them one final time and said something I never imagined saying to my own parents. "I spent years protecting this family's image. I'm done doing that now." Then I picked up the folder, turned around, and walked out, while my mother cried behind me and my father sat completely speechless in the living room. At that moment, I knew our family would never be the same again. If you believe betrayal hurts more when it comes from family, comment number 5 below. Because what happened after this confrontation became even more explosive than I expected. My sister's MBA celebration dinner was supposed to be the perfect family night, until my grandmother stood up and exposed everything in front of everyone. A week after my confrontation with my parents, Madison's MBA celebration dinner still went ahead exactly as planned. Expensive restaurant, private dining room, family friends, business connections. Every detail carefully designed to showcase the successful image my parents had spent years building around her. Part of me wanted to stay home and avoid the entire event completely. But another part of me needed to see what would happen now that the truth was finally surfacing beneath the surface of our family. When I arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere felt strangely tense. My mother smiled too hard every time someone looked in my direction. My father barely spoke to me at all. Madison acted as though nothing had changed, greeting guests confidently while talking excitedly about graduate school and future career opportunities. Watching her laugh under the soft restaurant lights almost made me question myself for a moment. Maybe silence really would have been easier for everyone. But then I looked across the room and saw my grandmother sitting quietly near the window, holding a folder on her lap. and immediately I knew this night was not going to end peacefully. Dinner started normally enough. People toasted Madison's future. My father gave a speech about sacrifice, family support, and hard work leading to success. Hearing those words come from him nearly made me sick. Every sentence sounded like a performance built on lies. I noticed my grandmother becoming more emotional as the speech continued. Her hands tightened around the folder, while my father proudly described how much the family had invested in Madison's dreams over the years. Finally, just as everyone raised their glasses again, my grandmother slowly stood up. The room immediately fell silent. She looked directly at my father first, and the disappointment in her eyes felt heavier than anger. Then she turned toward the guests and said something nobody there was prepared to hear. The success everyone is celebrating tonight was partially funded with money stolen from my other granddaughter. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Several people thought she was joking at first. Others stared at my parents in complete confusion. My mother instantly stood up and begged her to stop talking, but my grandmother ignored her completely. With shaking hands, she opened the folder and calmly explained how the trust funds had originally been divided equally between Madison and me. She explained the missing transfers, the forged paperwork, and the years of deception hidden behind the family's perfect public image. I watched the color completely drain from my father's face, while guests whispered around the room in disbelief. Madison kept repeating, "This isn't true," but her voice sounded less confident every time she said it. Then my grandmother looked directly at her and asked quietly, "Did you ever once question where all the money came from?" That question hit harder than every accusation before it. Madison opened her mouth but couldn't answer, because deep down, all of us already knew the truth. She may not have known every detail, but she benefited from the imbalance for years without ever wanting to see it clearly. One of my father's business associates quietly stood up and left the room. Then another followed. The carefully crafted image my parents spent years protecting was collapsing in real time right in front of everyone. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one carrying the shame anymore. My father finally exploded emotionally, accusing my grandmother of destroying the family publicly. But she looked at him calmly and replied with the sentence, "I will never forget." "No, you destroyed this family the moment you decided one granddaughter mattered more than the other." Nobody spoke after that. The dinner ended in chaos, whispers, tears, and people avoiding eye contact while leaving the restaurant. And as I walked out into the cold night air, I realized something important. The truth had finally become impossible for my family to hide. If you want to see what happened after my parents' public humiliation and how the legal battle began, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next chapter, because the downfall of my family was only beginning. After the truth exploded at the restaurant, my family's perfect image collapsed faster than any of them could control. The morning after Madison's celebration dinner felt unreal. I woke up to dozens of missed calls, unread messages, and social media notifications flooding my phone. News about the confrontation at the restaurant had spread far beyond our family overnight. Apparently, several guests had already started talking, and once rumors began moving through business circles and community groups, the story grew impossible to contain. For years, my parents had built a reputation around being successful, generous, and deeply devoted to family. But now people were whispering about forged signatures, stolen trust funds, and favoritism hidden behind polished smiles. My father called me repeatedly that morning, but I ignored every attempt. I already knew what he wanted: damage control, not accountability. By the afternoon, Aunt Helen informed me that one of my father's business partnerships was already under review because the scandal had made investors nervous. People who once admired him were suddenly questioning what kind of man would secretly steal money from his own daughter's future. Meanwhile, my mother became obsessed with appearances. She kept sending emotional messages begging me not to destroy the family publicly. That sentence alone told me everything. Even after the truth came out, her biggest concern was still protecting the family image instead of acknowledging the pain they caused me. But the situation became even more chaotic when Madison finally contacted me directly. Her message arrived late that evening. At first, she sounded defensive, insisting she never knew the full truth about the money. She claimed our parents handled everything and that she trusted them completely. Part of me wanted to believe her because despite everything Madison had also grown up inside the same unhealthy family system. But then her tone changed. Instead of apologizing for benefiting from the imbalance, she accused me of humiliating the family and ruining her future opportunities. "Do you realize what people are saying about me now?" she wrote angrily. I stared at the message for a long time before finally replying with the only thing I truly felt. "Do you realize what they did to me for years?" After that, she stopped responding completely. And honestly, the silence hurt more than the argument itself. Because for the first time, I realized my sister might never fully accept how much damage had been done to me emotionally. A few days later, my grandmother informed me that formal legal action was officially beginning. The lawyer had completed additional financial reviews and discovered even more unauthorized transfers connected to luxury expenses, investments, and personal accounts. The amount taken from my trust fund had become far larger than anyone originally imagined. My father was now facing not only family outrage, but possible legal consequences as well. The pressure inside the family became unbearable. Relatives started choosing sides. Some blamed my parents completely. Others begged me privately to forgive everyone and keep the scandal quiet. But I was exhausted from protecting people who never protected me. For years, I carried the emotional burden of their decisions, while they continued building comfortable lives with money meant for my future. I wasn't willing to stay silent anymore, simply to help them avoid embarrassment. One evening, while sitting alone in my apartment, I realized something surprising. Beneath all the anger and heartbreak, I no longer felt invisible. For the first time in my life, the truth about what happened to me was finally impossible for others to ignore. And strangely, that honesty felt freeing. My family's perfect image was collapsing, but so was the lie that I had somehow deserved less love and support than Madison. If you want to see what happened when the legal investigation officially turned into a courtroom battle, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next chapter, because the consequences my parents faced were far more devastating than anyone expected. The day my father walked into court, he finally looked like a man who understood he was about to lose everything. By the time the legal investigation officially reached court, the story had already spread throughout our entire community. People whispered when my parents entered restaurants. Old family friends suddenly stopped answering their calls. Business relationships my father spent decades building began disappearing one by one. But somehow, even after all the public humiliation, part of me still couldn't believe we had truly reached this point. Sitting inside the courtroom felt surreal. My grandmother sat quietly beside me, holding my hand tightly, while lawyers organized stacks of financial documents across long wooden tables. My father looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Not angry, not defensive, just defeated. My mother barely lifted her eyes from the floor the entire morning. Madison sat several rows behind us, completely silent, looking like someone whose perfect world had shattered faster than she could process emotionally. The evidence against my father was overwhelming. Financial records, forged signatures, unauthorized transfers from my trust fund into accounts connected to tuition payments, luxury expenses, and investments benefiting the family. Every document felt like another piece of my childhood being rewritten in front of strangers. At one point, the judge directly asked my father whether he knowingly transferred funds without proper authorization. The room became painfully quiet, waiting for his answer. My father closed his eyes for several seconds before finally whispering, "Yes." Hearing him admit it out loud hit me harder than I expected. Because despite everything, a small part of me had still hoped he would somehow prove this nightmare wasn't real. But it was real. Every painful memory, every sacrifice, every year I spent believing I simply mattered less. It had all been connected to choices he knowingly made. The court proceedings lasted several hours, but emotionally it felt like years. Eventually, an agreement was reached, requiring my father to repay a massive financial settlement connected to the stolen trust funds and lost investment growth. The total amount was far larger than the original education fund itself, because years of financial damage had accumulated over time. In addition to the repayment, several business investigations connected to his financial conduct remained ongoing. But strangely, none of the legal consequences seemed to hurt him as much as the emotional collapse happening inside the family itself. During a short break outside the courtroom, my father approached me carefully for the first time since everything exploded publicly. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "I never wanted you to hate me," he said quietly. I stared at him for a long moment, before answering honestly. "You spent years teaching me that my pain mattered less than keeping everyone else comfortable." He lowered his head immediately, because there was nothing left to deny anymore. My mother cried constantly throughout the day, repeating that she only wanted the family to stay together. But hearing those words no longer affected me the way they once would have. Families are not destroyed by truth. They are destroyed by the choices people make long before the truth finally appears. As we left the courthouse later that evening, reporters stood outside asking questions while cameras flashed everywhere. My father kept his head down the entire walk to the car, and for the first time in my life, I realized something important. I was no longer carrying the shame of what happened. The people responsible for the betrayal were finally carrying it themselves. The court case did not magically heal my pain. It did not restore the years I lost or erase the loneliness I survived. But it gave me something I had never truly received before: validation. Proof that what happened to me was real, unfair, and wrong. And that realization became the first step toward finally rebuilding my life on my own terms. If you believe justice sometimes comes painfully late, but still matters, leave a comment below, because the final chapter of this story changed my future in ways I never expected. After losing the family I thought I needed, I finally built the life I should have had all along. In the months after the court case ended, everything felt strangely quiet. For so many years, my life had been controlled by survival, disappointment, anger, and betrayal, that I almost didn't know how to exist without constant emotional chaos around me. The legal settlement eventually restored much of the money stolen from my trust fund. But what surprised me most was realizing that financial recovery did not automatically heal emotional wounds. There were mornings when I still woke up feeling like the forgotten daughter, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, hoping someone would finally choose her first. Trauma does not disappear the moment justice arrives, but slowly something inside me began changing. For the first time in my entire life, I stopped building my identity around earning love from people who never truly knew how to give it fairly. Instead of focusing on what my family destroyed, I started focusing on what I could finally create for myself. I used part of the settlement money to pay off every remaining student loan connected to my military education. Then I bought a small house, far away from the neighborhood where so many painful memories had lived for years. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. And for the first time in my life, peace felt more valuable than approval. I also began working with organizations supporting veterans struggling to rebuild civilian lives after military service. Sitting in those support meetings reminded me how many people silently carry pain while pretending to be strong for everyone else. Eventually, I helped create a mentorship program focused on young veterans who lacked emotional support systems at home. Every time someone told me, "You made me feel seen," I felt like I was slowly healing parts of myself too. My relationship with my family never fully recovered. My father eventually sent long apology letters, but most of them still sounded focused on guilt rather than accountability. My mother continued trying to reconnect emotionally, although every conversation felt fragile and complicated. Madison and I barely spoke for a long time. The distance between us was no longer just about money. It was about years of imbalance neither of us fully understood while growing up. But despite everything, I no longer carried hatred the way I once did. Anger had kept me alive for a while, but healing required something different: boundaries, distance, acceptance, and most importantly, honesty. Bought Potter, pot part, end case. I visited my grandmother again. We sat quietly together on her porch, while sunlight moved slowly across the garden. At one point, she looked at me softly and asked, "Do you regret exposing the truth?" I thought about the question for a long time before answering. The scandal destroyed reputations. It fractured relationships. It changed our family forever. But hiding the truth had already been destroying me long before anyone else felt consequences. "No," I finally said quietly. "I regret how long I believed I deserved it." My grandmother cried after hearing that because deep down, Both of us understood the same painful reality. The greatest damage my family caused wasn't financial. It was teaching me that love had to be earned through silence and sacrifice. But now I finally knew better. Real love does not require one child to disappear so another can shine. And as I looked out across the peaceful yard that afternoon, I realized something that once felt impossible. I had survived everything they did to me, without becoming bitter enough to destroy myself in the process. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share the lesson that stayed with you most. Because sometimes the strongest people are simply those who finally learn they deserved love all along.